Former minister and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Fransson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society. From messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted throughout our culture, Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him are groundbreaking artist and podcaster Jacqueline Clare, whose focus on spiritual realism is summarized by the quote, "When we don't take the high road with our choices and miss the opportunity to develop spiritual qualities, we literally forfeit the purpose of our lives." And Jill Surik, a conservative non-denominational Christian and registered nurse who moved her family from Wisconsin to Florida in carefully navigating this nation's rapidly changing child education and healthcare systems.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Created in the Image of God, where we explore the role of religion in society. And tonight we will be joined by Brad Otto as we explore the question, why does God allow suffering? Brad Otto is a returning guest. He is a pastor and certified life and mental health coach, and he is the founder and president of Acts of Wisdom, a nonprofit organization that helps children in rural Africa. And he is also the author of Finding Myself Again, which is available on Amazon and online booksellers everywhere. And with that, I'm going to bring Brad on to the show with us. Drum roll, the anticipation increases. Hey, it's Wade.
Hey, everyone. Guess what? I'm not Brad. We seem to be having a little bit of technical difficulty. We do hope to have Brad with us here shortly.
Okay.
And for those who have seen him here before, I'm sure you're looking forward to that. In the meantime, we'll have to just improvise.
Sure.
And Jacqueline, I don't know if you had some comments about tonight's show topic. We still have some of the materials. We could go through them, or if however you'd like to proceed in the next minute or two.
Yeah. Well, are we going to be getting into the euthanasia?
I'm not sure if Brad was planning to speak on that, but that's
right.
So we have an article that we were going to review with Brad. I don't necessarily want to jump into that immediately.
Mm-hmm.
We could. I don't know if you had any other introductory thoughts to the topic. The topic for tonight.
For the jugular.
the topic for tonight. We could actually express it in a couple of different ways. The big question that I had posed to Brad and wanted to cover is, why does God allow suffering?
Mm-hmm.
Brad has experienced his share of suffering, and he's also experienced his share of joy as he reaches out to help others and to relieve their suffering and to provide a contribution. But those who have dedicated their lives to service, especially in service to God, I think of Mother Teresa, have often done so with the goal of relieving suffering. And as a result, they often experienced a great deal of suffering themselves. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the diaries of Mother Teresa that were released a few years ago now. And as celebrated as she was as a person, and as much of an inspiration as she was to believers and non-believers alike around the world, her diary revealed a different side of her, a side that experienced deep despair, that in those moments where she was serving others, she often was unable to connect with God, to connect with Jesus. And sifting through some of the entries in her diary, it became clear that one of the things that weighed on her was her constant pouring out of sacrifice led her to a dark place where she asked, why is God allowing this in the first place? Right? Questioning God and his creation, questioning the purpose of humanity. As she experienced those intense, terrible pits of despair in which people were dying of hunger, dying of disease, neglected, and kicked to the curb and cast aside by society, and humanity in general was not reaching out to them or was not capable of providing them what they needed. And it left her from time to time in a very dark place, asking, why does God allow suffering? For me, years ago, one of the books that I read that helped me put words to this question was the book Man's Search for Meaning by Richard Frankl. Jacqueline, I don't know if you're familiar with the Mother Teresa
Absolutely.
side of things or that book by Richard Frankl, and if you have any comments on what I've just said.
Yeah. Well, God forbid my diaries are ever found. That was the first thought that came to me when you mentioned Mother Teresa. I did not know that about her, that release. Though that totally makes sense. And isn't that an interesting catch-22 of the spiritual work? Like, she went so head first into a godly path and fulfilling a need, but in that head first, she was encountering so much suffering and seeing the scale of it, and then asking why, and as far as
And just one word on that, we can be reminded of what Brad shared with us last time, because that's in essence the same journey that Brad experienced, right? So Brad was experienced a severe case of actual mental illness and ended up in a mental health hospital before he came through that. But he expressed some of the same things that we were just talking about, which is that when one is ministering to others and when one is helping others worship, one is oftentimes failing to actually worship oneself and not paying attention to the fact that one needs to be ministered to. I just wanted to throw that in, not necessarily interrupt you, but that's the context of why we wanted Brad on this show, and hopefully he'll still be able to join us in a moment. But you were about to address the other side of that.
Yeah, that's a really big one. Yeah, just what you just said about when you are ministering in whatever capacity, and how that last time Brad was here, and it reminded me of podcasting and things that we do too. And you have a background as a minister, but where you read the Holy Word not as absorbing for yourself, but to figure out like what you're going to say on Sunday. And that service can become a block if you're not careful about it. And it could be you're reading the Holy Word because you're trying to convince someone of its truth, or you're trying to teach your children, but you're not taking that time to be a soul communing with its creator and without any intention other than that. And then you mentioned Viktor Frankl, and yes, I am familiar with him. And I think probably many people, even if they don't know him, they know about, he with a why to live can withstand any how. So having a reason to endure suffering is what helps you to see it through. See, we have a comment. There's a video that's being recommended. Well, after you watch this one, then we can go watch the John.
So yes, Viktor Frankl. The question there that many viewers have is, who's Viktor Frankl, right? And what did he write about? So Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust victim. He was interred in a concentration camp. He was surrounded by death and despair and hopelessness. And for the Jewish people, that was a time when many lost faith, right? And that was the thing about Mother Teresa. She was actually losing her faith. That's where there was some hesitation about releasing those diaries. And I can't remember exactly the circumstances of how they got released, because this saint, right, this icon of faith, her despair came from the fact that she was not only in that dark place of suffering, she was losing her faith. She was losing her belief. She was literally saying, where is God? And it wasn't just a sort of a momentary, where's God in all this? But I don't feel like I can any longer connect to God. I don't feel like I can any longer relate to God. And for people who, in that sense, lose their faith, that's that question. Why would an all merciful, all loving God allow so much suffering? Right? There couldn't possibly be a God, because no God who claims to be what God claims to be would allow such abject suffering to take place. I can't believe in a God who would sit and watch while his children suffered to that degree. That's the place that many get to. And it's in a sense a fair and a legitimate question that people have. And it's a source of many of the people who have left religion over time because of that question. Well, that was what Richard Frankl was experiencing, along with, hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews who experienced what they did in the Holocaust. And Richard Frankl's book was really deep in the sense that he got at the question of the purpose of suffering, right? That suffering had a purpose, and those who found meaning in suffering were those who were more likely to actually survive and pull through. Those who found meaning in the suffering itself, right? And one of the verses that I'm sure Brad would have referred to and unpacked for us, were he here, is that Paul, the apostle in the New Testament, talks about Jesus having learned through his suffering. And one of the things that it's called out is that he learned obedience through his suffering. And this is a difficult concept, even for those who, believe that the Bible is the word of God. What does that actually mean? How do we unpack that? So that's sort of my introductory comments, Jacqueline. I don't know if you have something to add or some color to add to that, or take us in a different direction before we go to a commercial break and see if we can't find Brad and drag him in here.
Yeah, sure. Well, people have lost their faith because of suffering, but I also think that on the one hand, most of the suffering is from man. Like, I think the more heartbreaking occurrences often come from the things that man does, as in mankind. And also some people find God through suffering, because you get to a point where you sort of touch the most raw part of yourself and of life, and it can bring you closer to God, to perhaps out of necessity. But we have religious scriptures, like, for anyone who's sincerely asking that question, like, why does God allow it? Or it's also illustrated through the lives of those who have bore the world's great religions, like Christ on the cross. So if suffering is something, it's obviously an important part of this life, and we do have a scriptural foundation to remind us of that. So it's not answering the question of the why does it happen, but it's a good reminder that God is fully aware, and it's part of his design. Hence, his son on the cross, or, many other religious origin stories entail a great deal of suffering.
Thank you, Jacqueline. We'll have more on that when we come back, but we're going to move to our first commercial break, and we'll be back with you in about 60 seconds.
And welcome to Something or Other Publishing, or as our friends like to call us, Soup. Soup is a platform that connects authors, readers, and service providers in one convenient place. Choose Soup if you're an author with a great book idea and you're looking for a publisher offering hands-on coaching and some of the best royalties in the business. Or if you're a reader who enjoys engaging with celebrated and emerging authors. We already have over 3,000 of them. and more are joining every day. You can even win free books by voting on their book ideas. Or maybe you're a service provider and you're looking to engage with over 3,000 authors. We're here to help. So whether you're an author, a reader, or a service provider, you're in the right place at Soup. Contact us at help@soupllc.com to learn more.
And for all of you authors and potential authors that are watching the show, Something or Other Publishing is one of the main sponsors of this program. And we are working on a new approach, which will be unveiled over the next month or two, in which we'll be increasingly inviting high-profile guests to the show and inviting them to curate an anthology of contributions around the main topic of the show. This will be an incredible opportunity for those who are deeply interested in the topic of the show and who have a unique viewpoint, a unique area of study, research that they've done, even a fictional story that touches on it. These anthologies will be curated directly with the participation of those guests who may themselves be best-selling authors in their own right, and a compilation of perspectives and viewpoints that will deeply dive into the topic and explore it from a number of perspectives, often from multiple religious viewpoints, from psychology, from the field of science, so that these anthologies will be a deep dive into the topic at hand. And with the combination of the multiple authors and the experience that Something or Other Publishing has in producing anthologies and producing best-selling works by individual authors, and the growing list of readers and customers that want books from Something or Other Publishing, this will be a unique opportunity for anyone wishing to promote themselves as a writer, get their ideas out to an audience, hone their skills working with top-notch editors. So just wanted to put that individual plug as to why Something or Other Publishing is very interested in the show and what some of the plans are going forward. I want to now circle back to the topic for tonight. Why does God allow suffering? We've touched on it. We're still hopeful that we will be able to track down Pastor Brad Otto, who is suffering from some technical difficulties tonight in being able to connect with us. In the meantime, one of the articles that we wanted to talk about is the fear of suffering is driving us crazy. The fear of suffering is driving us crazy by Wesley Smith. This was published in December in Human Exceptionalism by the Discovery Institute. This is an analysis of what's going on in our society and how this conundrum of looking at suffering and trying to find ways to relieve suffering have in some cases crossed a line to go beyond the point of relieving suffering and actually transgressing into a territory where we're not allowing the stress and the growth that is needed. So I'd like to just dig into this and read some quotes from the article. So Wesley Smith talking about human exceptionalism on the Discovery Institute's blog. The primary purpose of society has shifted in recent decades from protecting innocent human life to eliminating suffering. This may seem like a small change in emphasis, but our suffering phobia has triggered a harmful societal neurosis that has both subverted human exceptionalism and undermined societal common sense. Let's start with the transgender moral panic. In the name of eliminating suffering in children with gender dysphoria, do no harm medical ethics have been cast aside to the detriment of the very patients in need of care. Case in point, the Biden administration and the American Pediatric Association, among others, insist that children identifying as the sex they were not born should receive drastic interventions such as hormones and puberty blocking and, quote, top surgeries, i.e. mastectomies, in girls aged 12 to 17. Occasionally, gender dysphoric children are even subject to bottom surgeries, genital mutilations that can result in a lifetime of sterility and sexual dysfunction. The author writes, California has been so corrupted by this ideology that it passed a law making itself a gender-affirming sanctuary state. And there are court cases now where those who feel differently are concerned that their children who may be living in California with another spouse are being subjected to these invasive surgeries. And what this author is talking about is how we got there. How did we get from where we were a few years and decades ago to the place where many clinical experts are advocating that this is a good thing, advocating that we should, in fact, proceed down this path, that we should, in fact, intervene to eliminate the suffering that children are experiencing, the suffering that we perceive in them around this topic of gender dysphoria. Whereas it can be objectively shown that suffering is being inflicted upon them.
Right. I definitely have a comment on that. To like one answer to the question, and I think you in the article illustrated what's going on and the insanity of it really well. And I think one of the answers as to like why has society gone to such lengths, this suffering phobia to the point where we're inflicting such incredible suffering, as you said, I think it's deep materialism. Instead of stopping to ask the question we're asking tonight, like, why does God allow it? What might be the purpose of whatever distress I'm going through, dysphoria, pain, whatever it is, why, like, instead of asking the deep spiritual questions and having faith and meaning and moving towards that, we just address everything on the level of the material, and that's all that we put attention on. And then that's why we're chopping things up and stuff, because we're not addressing the spiritual component at all.
To give a couple of additional data points on this societal shift, the writer continues then to talk about how the desire to eliminate suffering has even been applied to insects, right? And of course, we do have religious principles about protecting life and the sanctity of life. So, for example, not inflicting harm on animals and taking care of them. And of course, we would all agree that we should be very aware and seek to not inflict suffering anywhere. But it's gotten to the point where a paper was published claiming that insects should be protected by welfare laws. Quote, if insects feel pain, unquote, the authors worry, insect farming and pest control would cause mass suffering. Now, there would be certainly a lot of reasons to look into this topic, but is the suffering of insects something that we need to be, in this sense, overly concerned about? Has it gone too far? Meanwhile, some are claiming that humans must prevent plant suffering, right? Whereas, look, pruning plants is helpful for their growth and their survival. This is a principle that has been used in the context of even spiritual trials and tests, right? And the growth of our species. It's been shown scientifically that if you eliminate all stress on a living organism, that living organism will die, will atrophy. The quality of life will drastically go down once you cross a certain point of eliminating stress. So I'd like to highlight one of the ways that we've gotten here. I remember as a child in America watching TV ads, right? And all the things that I was programmed to desire and to want as a child. And I didn't have a particularly good childhood situation. The TV was often the babysitter, right? I was then transplanted to Sweden, which had very strict laws against advertising to children. And the children were, I'm sorry, I'm being distracted here by something. The children were transformed. I was transformed by not being exposed consistently to those ads, right? And when I came back to America, I noticed the consistency of the advertising pursuing this path of eliminating suffering. Let's talk about medicine, right? And the pervasive goal of eliminating all pain, right? Pain medication. And I have experienced this in my own experience with the medical community, but also am married to a doctor of physical therapy who works on pain reduction and pain elimination. The goal of reducing all pain to zero is part of the fuel behind the opioid epidemic, for example. And the fact that we are trained from a very young age from the stimulus that we receive from media, whether it be those TV ads that are constantly promoting every drug to relieve the symptoms of disease, especially pain. And people are being overly medicated and becoming addicted with the goal of simply eliminating pain, right? And pain thresholds that were considered perfectly normal in an accepted average everyday experience, such as when you work out with weights and your muscles are sore the next day as they rebuild themselves. So these are just inputs into how society has moved from where we were in the past to where we have ended up in this effort to eliminate any and all suffering, even to the detriment of the people that we're supposedly helping.
And again, unlike the example of Mother Teresa, and there's always going to be one extreme or the other, the appearance of paradox when we talk about spiritual phenomena. But, God forbid somebody find God in their suffering, even if it is physical recovery or something like that. So again, I feel like it's materialism and just this anti-God ideology that permeates.
Yeah, could you unpack that a little bit more for us, Jacqueline?
Yeah, well, just again, and for people who might have just tuned in, you gave the example of Mother Teresa, that her diary was recently released, and it revealed that as she went headfirst into alleviating people's suffering, and then she was seeing up close and personal how much suffering there is, and it actually started to create a crisis of faith in her. She started to feel further from God and wondering, like, why does this happen? So you have that on one side of this appearance of paradox as we explore the spiritual topic. And then on the other hand, you have where kind of the concept of hitting rock bottom, whether it's emotional pain or physical pain, where your knees hit the floor, metaphorically or literally, and you are more receptive and you actually find God. So in overly medicating people, whether for mental distress or physical distress, we're like trying to be a buffer, we as in society, to keep people potentially from having their knees hit the floor and finding God.
So some people will find God when they suffer, even as some people are losing faith in God because of seeing so much suffering.
Right.
or perhaps even because of the suffering that they themselves experience. So I bet if we interviewed those who have faith in a higher power, many of them would attest to this. And I think some of those who are looking at it from the other side would probably label that a crutch, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great one. I mean, this whole topic is one that is used by people who are atheists, or, this is like the great topic to poke holes in the whole God thing, right? Like, why does God allow suffering? And then, yes, if you only find God in the midst of terrible suffering, then is that a crutch? Something that's just helping you keep it together. I'd be real interested if people want to comment and see what they think about that specifically, the crutch or anything else we've talked about. It's kind of that appearance of paradox thing, because I can see the validity of that question and that argument. And recently we were talking about intellectualism and how intellectualism can be a barrier to finding God. But then you could also say, oh, so does that mean just stupid people find God? What does that mean? You know what I mean? Like, that's a similar argument you can poke holes in. So it's a good one. Yeah, it's not necessarily one that I can intellectually defend, because I have such a heart-centered feeling for the question that we're talking about.
Well, one thing that comes to mind, and this is a little bit random, but I remember reading a study years ago, and this is when I was a minister and I was working in Europe, and I was doing a lot of marriage counseling, and I was doing premarital counseling as people would prepare to get married, and then marital counseling for people who were having difficulties. And yes, we even did have some divorce in our fellowship, although I think our divorce figures were much lower than society around us, which was atypical even of religions. But I remember coming across a study that analyzed marriages that had taken place between people with various handicaps, and a variety of handicaps. These might be physical handicaps, it might be blindness, it might be deafness, it might be, and there are probably better words today to use. Those were the terms that were accepted at the time. I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anybody if I'm not using the current sensitive term to describe these things. But mental handicaps as well. And the studies showed that the success rate of marriage, as defined by people staying together and reporting happiness and fulfillment, was actually much higher in people who had these handicaps. And part of the analysis explained that they needed each other. They needed each other. And therefore, they put more effort into sustaining and nurturing and preserving the relationship. Remember the old wedding vow, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part? I mean, wouldn't you agree that there would be many ways to ascribe suffering to a person who was in a relationship with somebody else who was sick and dying of cancer?
Sure.
And does alleviating suffering mean get that person out of there? They shouldn't be exposed to having to care for somebody else who's dying. You follow me? In other words, if you start looking at this from different angles, the thing that sounds good on the surface, the thing that sounds kind on the surface, the thing that sounds sensitive, gender affirming, right? To encourage the person that, yes, your feelings of doubt about your sex, your feelings of doubt about the fact that you were born biologically male or biologically female. Yes, we want to encourage those feelings of doubt and worry and concern. And yes, you should now make these drastic changes. Or yes, oh, it would really be horrible to be stuck in a relationship with somebody who can't hear what you have to say, who's not able to listen to you talk, and you've got to learn a whole new language. Oh, that must be really difficult, sign language. Or, you could come up with these analogies to relieve the suffering of the person who is joyfully, in many cases, and with love and eagerness and tenderness and compassion, enjoying the relationship with somebody who has a need that you can fulfill
And I
participate in.
I think that's an interesting point. You the first thing you said about the marriage thing was that they needed each other. And I think that's very true. And there is something about hardship, even if it isn't like a physical need, but just encountering hardship together that like makes you stronger. But also, and what I think is even more beautiful is that people who encounter a great deal of suffering and live with suffering, that their capacity to appreciate grows. There's so many incredibly enlightened people that are like missing limbs and stuff, whereas like somebody else is upset because their latte isn't made right, and somebody else has found such capacity to touch joy and be present with God. And it's a pretty mystical phenomenon. I don't wish suffering on anyone in spite of that, reality. But I do think that people who experience suffering and who live with it tend to have a greater appreciation for people, for everything in this life, and families that care for a child with a handicap tend to be very close and have a great sense of joy. And you brought up these doctors who are affirming and encouraging people to walk down these paths of mutilation. And it's like, it's taking people away from appreciating life, taking people away from acceptance, all of these spiritual qualities of being present. They're constantly moving towards some ephemeral future, and they're constantly finding what's wrong with who I am, with this moment, with this situation, the pronoun you use to call me, like, as opposed to appreciating life.
Obsessing over microaggressions perpetrated against oneself, right? So we have examples of people who have suffered tremendously, and these people become inspirational figures that inspire others to overcome their own suffering, right? And then on the flip side, you have those who maybe aren't experiencing suffering, who have had success in life. Those people represent privilege, and we want to tear them down and deny that their work, that their effort, that their training, that their culture might have contributed to a common success or an individual success, right? We attribute the success of one person to obviously having somehow caused the suffering of another. So if we contrast suffering and a lack of suffering, it's like this obsession with, which is what this article is calling out, this obsession with relieving any and all suffering, as though the existence of that is in itself an evil. And it might have been wrong things, bad things, even evil things that are causing the suffering. But what Viktor Frankl, and I apologize, I was calling him Richard earlier, and I do know that it's Victor, but Viktor Frankl dug into was the meaning of the suffering itself, the value of the suffering itself, the gold that existed in that gold mine that you can only get to with the tools of digging into it through the suffering and coming out the other side. We're going to go to a commercial break again, and when we come back, we've got a special guest, someone from our audience who has a perspective that he would like to share with us. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back.
Hello. So we have a special guest, Ralph Shoemaker. Hello, Ralph. Welcome. I think you might be muted. Are you muted? Ralph, do you want to say hello? Okay, we're still not hearing him.
While we're waiting to resolve that, I'll just mention that the ad that was just played, Dr. Eric Monshine, author and celebrated individual, we'll tell you more about him later, will be featured on an upcoming show in February. We're locking down the date. A fascinating personality with a lot to offer. His book, Life at 12 College Road, is available everywhere books are sold, and is an amazing little journey.
Ralph, are you with us? I think we heard you for a sec.
Well, that's where I might look at it. Oh, can you?
Yes. Hi, Ralph. Welcome. So, Ralph, I know that you were in the comments. You've been here since the beginning. What's that?
Not connected.
Okay. No, we can hear you, Ralph. Can you hear us? This was a fun idea. Ralph, can you hear us? Can you hear me at all?
I don't know.
Are we connected?
I don't know we're
Ralph?
connected.
Okay, we are. Awesome.
I can see a figure. I don't see Wade. I don't see me, but I see you, Jacqueline.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. We can see you. There's a lot of space above your head, but we can see you, and it sounds like we're connected. Ralph, I know you've been with this show.
There's a technical difficulty of some kind.
Yeah, but we're live and we can hear you, so we're good. So if you want to stay, I wanted to ask you a few questions. Okay, Ralph? Can you move your device a little lower so I can see more of your face? Is that possible? There we go. That's better. Yeah, perfect. So, Ralph, I know that you were engaged in the comment section and you had some interesting things to say about this topic. And before we get to the topic, can you just tell us briefly where you are tuning in from? Where in the country or in the world do you live, Ralph?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I'm in Ithaca, New York.
Okay, you're in New York. Wonderful.
Maddie was here for a while. I'm between Portland and Ithaca. Well, okay. I was going to talk to
I think our audio connection is just not strong here, you guys.
Yeah, your audio has cut out.
Okay. Well, that was a really fun idea. I would just like to share with the audience the behind the scenes of what we're doing with that. So, you know, we've had a mystery disappearance of our guest, and we hope everything is fine. And Ralph was in the comment section. So who knows, you guys, you might be brought on as a special guest one day. Ralph had some engaging comments early on. And so we asked if he wanted to jump in, and had the technical spirits been more on our side, that might have gone a little more smoothly. But so that was it. We were just bringing someone up from the audience to share some philosophical ideas about God versus evil in the world, and maybe what his faith perspective says about that.
I'd like to just share a different comment from another one of our viewers, who had also said today is becoming more like a dystopian novel. Everyone is drugged up. And that may have gotten or been related to some of the comments we were making a little while ago. And Arthur, who has perhaps been giving end of life care to folks before, has seen that in process, but also knows what it's like to give genuine care and try to not necessarily relieve every symptom of physical discomfort, but rather provide medicine for the soul, medicine for the heart, medicine for the spirit, which often involves encouragement to keep on fighting, encouragement to keep on swimming upstream. Having lived in Alaska, we had this common statement: any dead fish can float downstream. It takes a live, healthy one to swim upstream. And for those who know, they're referring to the salmon, whose goal it is to spawn, right? And the salmon basically destroy themselves on the way to fulfilling their purpose, right? So when salmon spawn, they're returning to the place of their birth. They've maybe lived out in the ocean for 3, 4, 5 years, however long that part of their life takes place, and they have to return to the place of their birth. And once they enter the freshwater, they stop eating and they begin swimming upstream, and they're using up all the fat, all the stored energy that they've gained while feasting in the ocean, and they're getting beat up against the rocks. And literally, their fins are getting destroyed, their bodies are getting beaten up, and many of them, they're half dead when they get there to spawn, and many of them don't even make it. And once they spawn, they die and they're flushed downstream, and they're floating downstream by the tens of millions, during a healthy ecological time. But the very purpose of their life is to endure, in that sense, immense suffering near the end of their life to fulfill their purpose, which is to procreate and to spawn and to give new life.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. We don't know the effects of our lives, and our suffering might take us down paths to discover ways to alleviate it or make us more tender towards other people. Like, our suffering isn't just for us alone. It impacts the way we contribute to the world. There was actually another comment by Sabrina Laumer that I thought was interesting, if I may. Wade, read it.
Sure.
Yeah, she said, maybe people don't want to submit to God and justify their own willful failings by rejecting God. I just thought that was interesting, that maybe in suffering and accepting suffering, there's an element of submission to God, which is a very, I know our guest last week didn't like the word vulnerable, but to me, it does sound very vulnerable to submit, to surrender to God.
In the context that it was used, he might very much like the word in this context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I often try to shy away, and this is based on decades of experience, of saying things about unbelievers that could be deemed judgmental, and I'm sure that's not Sabrina's intent here at all. Some people might read it that way, that one could sit and sort of judge their experience and where they're coming from. But I think the point that you raise is a very good one, about the again that meaning that people derive from it, right? And that that ability to look deeply within and recognize even choices that might have led to the suffering, and that some of those consequences, whether it's at an individual level or at a societal level, right, lead us to make substantive changes. I can again share a personal experience where I actually was diagnosed with a very severe health condition when I was ministering in Germany. And this situation became so severe that it actually was a part of me having to return to the United States, and was offered on disability, and I was offered permanent disability due to the nature of the illness, the progressive nature of it, and the fact that I was diagnosed by doctors in 3 countries. And the trajectory was that I was going to end up in a wheelchair at age 40. And here I am, lo and behold, 41 years old and not in a wheelchair, he said jokingly. But the point is, at that time, I knew and had experienced supernatural healing. That may be difficult for some in the audience to understand, but I had prayed to God previously and experienced immediate supernatural intervention. You can disbelieve in that. I'm not trying to convince anybody that actually happened. I know that it happened, right? And there were in fact witnesses at the time that it happened. But the point of such a miracle, if you will, is not to convince anybody else, but God would have a very specific reason for doing that at the time. So I naturally was in distress that I was in this situation, and I went to God fervently in prayer and study and asked him to remove this illness. And God's answer to me was, no, I'm not removing this illness. And along with that answer came the understanding and the awareness that, dude, you are sick. And there are some things that you can and should do to change. And again, my comments earlier about not judging, very important here. This does not mean that I would ever, ever, ever judge anybody else and look at them and say, well, God's trying to teach you a lesson. You need to change. That's not my purpose, or my role is to tell you what God is trying to tell you, right? Or whether or not he is or isn't doing this or that, or taking this or that approach, or whether it was or wasn't your own fault or anything you did that got you there. Sure, provide help, education, support, but the key here was education, right? So the healing that I experienced, because as I mentioned, I am 41 years old at least, and I'm not in a wheelchair. The healing that I experienced was supernatural in the sense that none of the doctors had any hope of me overcoming this. They wanted to prescribe cortisone and other drugs to treat the symptoms and ease my pain. But what I knew even at the time about cortisone was that's not really going to help me, is it? No, it's actually going to make me worse, isn't it? Well, it could, because I was already experiencing adverse reactions to the cortisone that they forced me to take, that they injected in me to save my eye because I was going blind in one of my eyes. And the cortisone helped with that particular situation, but it made me very sick. So the point is, the healing came through the suffering, because the suffering forced me to change almost everything about myself, what I thought, how I ate, how I worked out, the approach that I took when I was exercising. No alcohol, no sugar, no salt, no meat, right? Basically, I was eating, raw vegetables, steamed, and salads, and the salad dressing that I was using was lemon and avocado in a blender. But it wasn't just the diet. It was this whole host of other things, including the way I approached my relationships with other people. So I became transformed through that suffering. But had I opted the path of relieving the suffering, those benefits would not have accrued. I would have potentially sunk into a misery of life isn't fair and, oh, woe is me. And I'm in constant pain. I was in constant pain, but I didn't want the painkillers. It's not that I wanted to experience the pain, and I would never advocate that anybody else should like the pain. I hope we don't think of ourselves that way, of liking pain. But rather, I wanted to see what God was teaching me through that. So, and in the end, great blessings came from it. Again, I'm not in any way advocating anybody else's specific circumstances here. Just that was my own experience with how suffering can provide many benefits and many rewards once one comes through it, whether in this life or, as believers would insist upon, in the next life. And I don't know if, Jacqueline, you have any thoughts about that ultimately. And this is the role of religion, right? Is to instill that inspiration that there is hope, even not in this life. I'll pull up a quote on that in a minute, but in the meantime, would be very interested in hearing your thoughts and reactions to all that.
I think your story was a great illustration of the only way out is through, and a bit of a hero's journey, how you learn things by going through the fire and through the ordeals. And that was a really nice illustration of that.
Not everyone.
We got to throw that comment up there. We have to put William's comment on the screen.
Please do.
Thank you.
Oh, well, yes. I'm very happy, William, that we're not imposing suffering on you tonight. I'm looking for this quote about, and it's Paul, but I'm having trouble finding it. Just give me a moment here. Jacqueline, is there a time when you personally or somebody you knew had a similar experience with suffering? Or
yeah, while you're looking for that quote, I will share that one time I was going through a hard chapter in my life, and I kept praying to be relieved of it. I forget what the sort of spiritual word I was using was, but some sense of escape or relief, like, God, please take away my suffering, please change this situation. And it wasn't until it occurred to me to pray, God, please help me endure. Am I still on? There we go. I started praying for God to help me endure what I was going through. And that's actually when things started to change. So the prayers to just eliminate suffering didn't, but the prayers to become the stronger person who could move through it were answered. And it actually led, to ultimately an alleviation of the situation. So that was an interesting experience of learning for me.
Yeah, this is the quote that I was looking for, and I mangled it the way I put it in there. Sorry. If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men the most pitiable. Right? From 1 Corinthians 15, verse 18. Paul here highlighting that it's not always about this life. And whether it is in this life and suffering and trials and challenges do deliver great fruits, the virtues, the qualities that emerge when we experience those things, even in this life, right? No pain without gain, or all those sayings, no gain without pain, all those sayings that we're familiar with. There's truth to them. There's common sense. And these are the things that people throughout human history have understood. But today, with the capabilities that we have, science, medicine, and the incredible wealth that's being produced globally, which inequitable distribution of wealth is certainly a topic we will address on this show in the future. But that doesn't mean that everything that could be done should be done. The capabilities that we have that have never been had before to potentially relieve human suffering, we need to take care and take thought and not throw out everything that we've learned over thousands of years just because we have now been given the car keys, and not be the teenager that ends up driving that car off the cliff. We're gonna make one more quick commercial break, and then we'll come back and wrap this show up tonight.
Well, thanks for being with us tonight. Tonight was an exciting adventure exploring this question of why does God allow suffering? And there was a lot of engagement in the comments tonight. So we really appreciate that. It really added a lot to this discussion. Once again, this is Created in the Image of God, and we are live every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. And we will be back next week, that same time, with another special guest and more spiritual conversations exploring the role of religion in society.